Hey everybody, David Boris here. Before we begin, I wanted to take a minute to ask you to check us out on Patreon. It's a great way to support this podcast because if you become a patron at patreon.com, you get early ad-free releases and exclusive behind-the-scenes bonus content you won't hear anywhere else. Patreon is a safe and secure way to support the podcast on a monthly basis. It helps me keep the show growing, and it helps me keep the show going. So become a patron today at patreon.com/hostilehistory. Okay, let's get to the show.
Late night bites with friends? Already hard to beat. That first too hot bite of fries you couldn't wait for, followed by ice cold Pepsi. Now that hits different. Suddenly, the energy kicks back in, the night goes longer, and the laughs don't stop. Because Pepsi brings out more flavor, more fun, and more of the moment. Food deserves Pepsi. Grab a Pepsi Zero Sugar today.
The Colonel's cooked up a new $10 bucket of the day just for you. Monday, 10 wings for $10. Tuesday, 8-piece fried chicken for $10. Wednesday, 8 tenders for $10. Thursday, 10 wings for $10. Friday, 24 nuggets for... Ooh, you guessed it, didn't you? $10. The $10 bucket of the day deal. Every weekday. Only at KFC. It's finger licking good.
Prices and participation vary while supplies last. Not available on third-party ordering platforms. Tax extra.
Smoke stains the horizon. Fields lie stripped and broken. Around her, the march never stops. She carries what she can. Bread scavenged, clothes folded, hope rationed. At night, by dim firelight, she stitches torn uniforms with steady hands, her children pressed close against the cold, their hunger quiet but constant. Her husband marches somewhere ahead, just another figure swallowed by dust and orders. She measures each day by rumors of coming battles, each one tightening the knot in her chest. If he falls, her fragile world along the roadside may collapse with him. Still, she moves forward, step for step with the army, refusing to be left behind, because survival for her and her children depends on staying close to the thin line between war and home.
So if you think about the mass graves in, say, Vilnius, in today's Lithuania, from Napoleon's retreat from Moscow in 1812, where lots, as you know, I mean, the French death rate was somewhere between 400 and 500,000, and most of those people died of hypothermia and typhus in places like Vilnius, where they were then dumped in mass graves. Well, we can tell from the skeletons that a lot of these people were women.
I'm David Boris. I'm a military historian, and this is Hostile History, a podcast where we go inside some of the most defining conflicts and rebellions. In this episode, I'm joined by Margaret Hunt, emeritus from Uppsala University in Sweden, as we travel Europe between the 15th and 17th centuries to tear down misconceptions, camp followers and conscripts, women in Europe's early modern armies. When you think of war in the past, it's easy to assume that conflicts were fought by men. Other than Joan of Arc and a few others, women are seldom considered as military heroes, but that is not actually true. War has never been fought by men alone. That idea, which feels familiar, repeated, and deeply embedded in popular imagination, isn't just incomplete, it's historically wrong. Long before uniforms were standardized, ranks were introduced, and rifles replaced musket and pike, women were present in armies across Europe. From the wars of religion in the 16th century, to the devastating 30 Years' War in the 17th century, to the global 7 Years' War in the 18th century, and the massive Napoleonic Wars of the 19th century, women were there. While officially barred from combat roles, they were far from absent. Many accompanied armies as camp followers. They cooked, cleaned, cared for the wounded, helped manage supplies, and kept daily life functioning. Some women also acted as sutlers, selling goods to soldiers, or took on informal medical roles before professional nursing existed. Women in the military are not just some modern product of the 20th century. They've been present in and around the battlefield for as long as humans have gone to war, just rarely acknowledged as so. Even more rare, there are documented cases of women disguising themselves as men to fight. For instance, Hannah Snell served in the British military in the 18th century. And behind every army is a network, whether in the past or today, and much of that network has been dominated by women. They may not have always been in the front lines, but they were never absent from the battlefield. They were always making a contribution. They marched, they worked, they fought, and even at times led. But as armies modernized, something changed. So today, we're traveling back to find out more about these unsung heroes and trace that shift from the fluid, chaotic armies of early modern Europe to the rigid, male-dominated institutions of the later eras. Because women have been there through it all, and they refuse to disappear. Early modern Europe generally spans from the late 15th century to the late 18th century. And that's where we begin our journey, on the bridge between the medieval world and the start of the Industrial Revolution. These were centuries of transformation. Medieval Europe had been characterized by fragmented politics and feudalism, while society was under profound religious influence. The armies were not the tightly organized, state-controlled forces we think of today. They were loose, often temporary coalitions of vassals, knights, peasant farmers, and others who had been summoned to fight for their lord based on land ownership. And they were often joined by mercenaries.
So I would say some of the key issues are how expensive and extraordinarily wasteful war is in most time periods, but certainly in the early modern period. So what that means is a central way that states finance war is by raising taxes, obviously. But the ways that they raise taxes tend to be very regressive, so that they put huge burdens on the poorest people in society. That tends to be excise taxes on necessities like salt, for example, is a big favorite. Customs taxes, which again tends to target poor and middling kinds of people. And war, for various reasons, even more perhaps than today, is also very often associated with economic depression or recession. So the result is that you have a lot of sort of rather broadly spread pain that comes from war upon already pretty impoverished populations in many cases. Now, those impoverished populations are also the groups from which soldiers tend to come. So what this means for the study of, war, women, men, is that there's, I would say, a lot more focus today on what war means for a lot of different people other than those particular guys who end up on the battlefield.
Margaret Hunt, a professor emeritus from Uppsala University in Sweden, says the key to understanding women's roles in modern warfare is to first look and understand how war is funded. Because war isn't just all about what happens on the battlefield. And as soon as you broaden your view and include how conflicts impact society at large, you begin to find a lot of people who in past history might have been sidelined as non-combatants.
There's also delayed payment of troops, which means that these quite poor people often have to wait years to get paid for their military service, which also redounds back upon their families. And you see, there's lots of examples of this having really pretty significant effects on populations. Like, for example, in Hesse Castle, which, as you may know, is the source of the most famous mercenary troops of the 18th century, the Hessians, famous particularly in North America. Well, an extraordinarily large number of young Hessian men actually end up getting sucked into the Hessian mercenary system because it's making lots of money for the Landgrave of Hesse. And so families start, well, as happens in any war in the early modern period and still today, slightly better off families try to buy their sons out of service. What that means actually, and now we know something about the financing of this, is that they take money from the dowries of the women to pay for the guys to get out of military service. So one result is that there's a pretty precipitous drop in the marriage rate because the money, I mean, it's a kind of a classic example of the way money gets funneled out of one group. I mean, poor people, in this case, funneled away from women and into the war effort, in this case, indirectly by people trying to get their sons out of the 18th century equivalent of the draft. So there's a lot of this kind of thing. In Sweden, for example, which is a cash-strapped state, the state, in order to finance their particularly in the 17th century, Sweden is very expansionist power in the 17th century, but they haven't really got money to pay their troops. So what they do is that they give plots of land to the wives who then farm them while the men are away. So it's a very explicit use of the labor of women to pay for the military service of their husbands. In other places, Denmark, for example, and other parts of Europe as well, they give women, wives of sailors, they give licenses to beg or licenses to sell stuff on the street to compensate for the fact that they've got their husbands in the military and probably not getting paid. So when these guys are home on leave, these women are required by law to support them, so just, this kind of moving around of funds and work and between women and men and well-off people and particularly poor people is really, really common in early modern war.
So women in impoverished or poor communities had to take up the economic burden of men going off to war, which means they needed coping methods in order to survive. Women would sometimes be forced to go from theater to theater as entire communities followed armies on the march. They were often called camp followers, and they became essential. Armies back then didn't have supply chains as we know them today. Survival depended on labor, and much of that labor was done by women. But that's only part of the story, because in moments of crisis, women became more than just an extra hand.
The perfect lunch combo. That first bite of your favorite sub, followed by ice-cold Pepsi. Add a couple of friends, and now that's next level. Suddenly, the laughs get louder, the stories keep flowing, and the food tastes better. Because Pepsi brings out more flavor, more fun, and more of the moment. Food deserves Pepsi. Grab a Pepsi Zero Sugar today.
This episode is brought to you by ChatGPT. Hey, it's Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast. Have you guys heard about ChatGPT work? It's the new way to use ChatGPT for bigger multi-step projects. And when you need more than just answers, give ChatGPT work access to your apps and files, and it can create real work documents like spreadsheets, slides, and structured reports. Get started at chatgpt.com by selecting work mode, available on Plus and Pro plans.
Take Joan of Arc. In the early 15th century, during the 100 Years' War between England and France, Joan of Arc didn't just accompany soldiers, she led them. She had been a teenage peasant who claimed divine guidance, and with it, Joan commanded French forces and helped lift the siege of Orléans. Her presence wasn't symbolic, it was strategic, inspirational, and real. And she wasn't entirely alone. In wars like the 30 Years' War or the Anglo-Dutch War of the 17th century, women may have been officially barred from combat roles, but they were far from absent.
In the 30 Years' War, they're still actually contracting out large artillery to private artillery
Right. Yeah.
groups who often arrive with their wives, servants, huge numbers of horses and pack animals to pack these extraordinarily large weapons across landscapes. So the point is that lots and lots of stuff actually gets devolved onto entities that are not the state. So in some ways, this undercuts the rise of the nation state kind of argument, because people are saying, well, look, I mean, the state isn't actually doing this. It's actually contracting this out. So the reason why that this is interesting from the perspective of women and gender is that a lot of contract activity is done by women. So, for example, women are getting together in almost factories. I mean, this is sort of pre-industrial, but factories to make military clothing. They're involved in some of the earliest industrial production of rations for militaries. They probably invent some of the early preservation techniques that are used for military rations. And there's also women involved in shipbuilding. I mean, there's the famous example of Anne Wyatt, who built 7 ships for the Royal Navy in the 1690s, including 3 third-rate 80-gun third rates. So, there's actually some quite big contractors who are women, particularly in war finance. One of the major war finance people in the southern Netherlands was a woman. So, you see, and then lots and lots of women invest in the national debt, which is essentially in most countries paying for war. So these are all examples of the spreading out of the pain and costs of war. But again, once you do that, you include lots of people that we don't typically tend to think of in relation to military history, and yet they're absolutely essential to the waging of war. I mean, it could not have been done without them.
Now, the 30 Years' War broke out in 1618 as primarily a war between Catholic and Protestant states. However, within only a few years, the political rivalries of Europe trumped the religious loyalties, and soon almost every major kingdom and political entity was drawn into conflict. Most historians agree that until the First World War, it was the most devastating conflict to ever have been fought on European soil. In some regions of what is today northern Germany, population decline was as high as 30% from war, disease, and starvation. And in societies where war could arrive at your doorstep, participation wasn't always optional.
This varies a lot from country to country, how many young men actually get conscripted. So in a big country like France, it could be a quite small percentage of the kind of military age men, if we think of that as like 18 to 30, 35, or something like that. Whereas in a smaller country like Sweden, in some of those major wars, it turns out to be a really amazing proportion of the young men of that age. So it depends a lot where you come from. But it does raise some real issues for the workforce that's left, particularly because, I mean, in all early modern societies, the manual work gets done by people, both men and women, between the ages of 18 to 35, basically. They're the strongest. People start to deteriorate physically after 35, oftentimes. So you're taking out of society, often permanently, the biggest earners. And you're leaving very, very hard work to be done by a much, much smaller group of people. The workforce participation of women outside the home is somewhere around 95%, which is higher than today. So what happens is that you have women already working, but they're doing double the work,
Right.
you would say. And it's, again, that age group, 18 to 35. I mean, it's also the biggest childbearing age for women. By the way, most childcare is done by old people and little children. It's not done by mothers because they're out, making money. All of this is really complicated in terms of the work structure of the localities that end up sending people away. And that doesn't even include the people who come back disabled and have to be sort of nursed for the rest of their lives. It doesn't include there's accounts of women being hitched to the plow because all of the farm animals had been taken. In addition to the men. So, again, it's these kinds of, gritty details about the burdens that war places on people, both sexes, that I think often doesn't get in so much into the record of how war actually worked.
Margaret said some of those burdens were carried predominantly by women, primarily out of desperation.
One of the things about war is that it's very hard to differentiate desperation from coerced work, especially when you've got these situations where mostly poor populations are the ones who are paying the biggest price in terms of lives lost, in terms of enforced poverty, in terms of a lot of things. And then, of course, you have the added problem of going through enemy territory oftentimes. I mean, there's actually coerced work, not just in enemy territory. It's a big problem, especially in periods of epidemics. I mean, the famous example is that there were major typhus epidemics on the ships during the 9 Years' War, 1689 to 1698.
Yep.
And so major typhus epidemics. So what did they do? They unloaded the guys with typhus onto poor women in port towns all around England, Deal, Portsmouth. And so, you got these women who are not in a position to refuse. Often they're forced to do it because they're taking they're people on getting parish relief. So they're forced to take in, 5 to 6 desperately ill, often dying men with a contagious disease into their homes, and then not paid for it, oftentimes. So there's actually some interesting strikes. There's a strike of the Portsmouth landladies. There's actually a bunch of strikes of these. They were called landladies, but they were actually nurses. There were strikes by these women over the fact that they're not being paid, and also demonstrations about the fact that they were all getting sick. Because typhus or dysentery. These are contagious diseases. So that's kind of a classic example of how coerced work worked not on enemy territory, but you can imagine on enemy territory that all kinds of other stuff goes on. Forced sex, forced prostitution, forcing prisoners of war to build groundwork, fortresses, and there's a lot of bury the dead. One point to make is that something like forced sex is by no means just women. There's quite a lot of rape of men as well as women, particularly in the 30 Years' War, which only now, with the example, say, of in the 20th century of Yugoslavia, where there was a lot of sexual depredations against men as well as women, that people are realizing this is a more complicated kind of thing than just opportunistic rape of whichever women happen to be in the place you were billeting, or whatever it might be.
As a military historian, I know that war is much more than just one man commanding troops around a battlefield. There are broader societal impacts, and one place we can see that is in a place we mentioned earlier, the baggage train.
What the baggage train actually is partly lots of people who who attach themselves to armies because the armies need their services. So again, the classic contracting out of food provision, nursing, laundry is a very big thing. I mean, you really need laundry because if you're on the march, you get lice really badly unless you wash your clothes. So who washes the clothes? Well,
Right.
the camp followers do. The baggage train is the same as the camp followers.
Yeah.
So it's nursing. It's what have I mentioned? Finding food, foraging about in the countryside, robbing corpses, burying corpses. I mean, there's lots of jobs that are kind of essential to the semi-smooth operation of an early modern military that are contracted out. So, there's lots and lots of jobs to do in the early modern army, and lots of those jobs are done by women. And there's a tendency for those women who would otherwise be homeless or to be saddled with a degree of wage labor that was very difficult to cope with and was very low paid. It was often of an advantage to them to attach themselves to the military, because one of the things that militaries offer is, even though people might not be paid very much, they still have more ready cash than most other random communities do.
Mm-hmm.
So that, and also if the army is on the move, it means there's all kinds of foraging opportunities, particularly if you have weapons in your hand. So there's this intersects with plundering. It intersects with a lot of other kinds of some of the more unpleasant activities of armies on the move in any time and place, but particularly in the early modern period, where you don't have very organized food supplies necessarily. You don't have organized nursing care until pretty late in the period that we're talking about. So the army needs these people, and individual soldiers often want to have their wives and children with them. So the baggage trains are often pretty large. I mean, there are accounts in the 16th century of baggage trains that are larger than the than the armies that they accompany. By the 17th century, they're pretty often about the same size, and then they get getting smaller in the 18th century. But there's still plenty of cases where an army of 40,000 men might have 20,000 people in the baggage train. They pose their own logistical problems. So there's lots of evidence of both of the necessity for the baggage train, given the ways that early modern armies worked, and the kind of implications. I mean, after the Battle of Poltava in 1709, in the Great Northern War, a lot of women were captured by the Russians. A lot of Swedish women were captured by the Russians and carried off as prisoners of war into Russia. Some of them never came back. A lot of them never came back. So they're definitely sometimes suffering from the same kinds of things that the men do, but their position is obviously different in relation to pay.
This changes over time as we transition further through the Renaissance, and growing wealth and trade allowed certain political leaders to fund change and innovation. This is when we see the Protestant Reformation and witness the age of exploration, with the colonization of the New World and the emergence of diverse global trading networks. As this happens, the world becomes more connected than ever before, a pivotal change, and Europe's armies also begin to change. States grew stronger and more centralized, which meant wars became longer and more expensive. Rulers needed discipline, consistency, and control, which led to the development of standing armies. These were permanent, professional forces loyal to the state, rather than a feudal lord or a paymaster. With that shift came regulation. Armies began to standardize everything: uniforms, drills, hierarchies. They also began to decide who was allowed to belong. Women, who were once embedded in the fabric of military life, were increasingly pushed to the margins.
The perfect lunch combo. That first bite of your favorite sub, followed by ice-cold Pepsi. Add a couple of friends, and now that's next level. Suddenly, the laughs get louder, the stories keep flowing, and the food tastes better. Because Pepsi brings out more flavor, more fun, and more of the moment. Food deserves Pepsi. Grab a Pepsi Zero Sugar today.
This episode is brought to you by ChatGPT. Hey, it's Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast. Have you guys heard about ChatGPT work? It's the new way to use ChatGPT for bigger multi-step projects. And when you need more than just answers, give ChatGPT work access to your apps and files, and it can create real work documents like spreadsheets, slides, and structured reports. Get started at chatgpt.com by selecting work mode, available on Plus and Pro plans.
The notion of lots of women kind of fanning out, gathering food and bringing it back to this army on the march, it doesn't seem very efficient or very kind of orderly. Similarly with the fact that some percentage of camp followers were prostitutes, but there is a period when there's quite a lot of concern about the sexual practices of soldiers particularly. And it coincides again with this period when they're starting to see the efficient military as a military that's centrally organized, develops a lot of its own supply, which is probably a more efficient way of organizing supply after all. I mean, you can plan better. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why it's not a bad idea to have a centralized supply. And in the face of this, the camp followers start looking less and less modern. It's very hard to control women. You know, if it's all decentralized like that and people are just building in other people's houses, it's hard to say, oh, well, you can't have your wives with you. You can't have any women around. I mean, it's just impossible to administer. But if you have purpose-built barracks, it gets much easier to say, well, you can't have women in here. Now, what we know from pictures of barracks is that they weren't especially successful at this for a very long time. And a lot of women actually just moved into the barracks with their families. But you can see how over time it would be much easier, particularly if you have this notion that the military shouldn't be, it should be all men. It should be centrally organized. It should organize its own supply, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why camp followers and the baggage train would come to be seen as less and less efficient and more problematic.
Margaret said baggage trains may have been cumbersome, but they have never really disappeared. They got rebranded. You can't entirely eliminate. I mean, of course, now there's lots of women in the military.
Of course.
But even at the time, at the height of the notion of a male military, which is a fairly brief period, essentially less than 100 years, even at the height of that, you still had to have things like military bases.
I have to agree. A military base today is a modern operating city in almost all regards. But as I also mentioned earlier, women weren't just relegated to the sidelines. And although by the time of the Crimean War in the mid-19th century, women's roles shifted towards more organized roles, think Florence Nightingale and others helping to formalize nursing as a respectable and essential profession within the military.
The most common jobs for women in the battlefield is usually the vivandière, particularly in France and the United States. These are women who they're intended as sort of morale boosters. They carry kegs of wine around to deliver to the men during, or brandy as the case might be. I mean, whatever the alcoholic beverage of choice is when going into battle. And they they're quite often young. They're quite often married to a relative of somebody in a particular division or regiment. And yeah, I mean, they're right in the thick of the battle, and lots of them were killed. I mean, famously at Waterloo. I mean, nobody knows how many women died at Waterloo, but there's clearly quite a lot.
Really?
Yeah, because they were particularly French vivandières. They were very popular in the French artillery, especially, and then they became quite popular again in the United States especially during the Civil War. And now those are not, they don't fight per se. I mean, probably a few of them did, but they're certainly in the thick of battle.
Women served closer to the front lines, though still not as combatants. But that hadn't always been the case. As I mentioned earlier, Joan of Arc and Hannah Snell were in battles, face to face, with other combatants, and they weren't the only ones.
I think that most of the women soldiers that we know about that have left accounts or accounts of them are in more irregular kinds of troop, guerrilla bands, that sort of thing. So, for example, I'm thinking of a woman called Renée Bordereau, who was a French, essentially in the Vendée War, and she's involved in attacking the French. The Vendée is a revolt against the French Revolution. And she's involved in various sorties and war crimes. I mean, like killing unarmed prisoners of war, as you do if you're an irregular, apparently. But that tends to be the kind of context where you see more women soldiers. Of course, the French Revolution, I mean, women soldiers are always more common in I would say, in revolutionary situations or in civil wars.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Where patriotism becomes really key. When women come out to fight for a particular cause, that gives it a sort of a sacral quality, or it particularly emphasizes patriotic love of country. That even the women are out doing whatever it is.
Right.
So they're definitely around, and then there's some women who certainly became soldiers because they just wanted to get away from where they were.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they're certainly around. I think it's a pity that so much attention has been made to them and not to some of the other sort of more complicated kinds of things. But yeah, there certainly are some quite interesting ones. Actually, some quite interesting people. Who ballads, and it's clearly an aspect of popular culture as well.
Yeah.
Women have always been part of war. The industrialized slaughter of the 20th century opened limited but significant cracks in the system. Maria Bokareva took this further than most, forming the Women's Battalion of Death during the First World War. Her unit fought on the Eastern Front both as a military experiment and as a political statement aimed at shaming reluctant male soldiers into continued resistance. It was, however, the even larger conflict of the Second World War that most fully demonstrated women's capacity for direct combat in Europe. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Soviet Union, where women were systematically integrated into frontline roles. Lyudmila Pavlichenko became one of the deadliest snipers in history, her hundreds of confirmed kills challenging any lingering notion that combat effectiveness was inherently male. Others, like Rosa Shanina, another Soviet sniper, gained a reputation for aggressive tactics, deliberately seeking out frontline engagements rather than remaining in a defensive position. Beyond the formal battlefield, war in Europe also unfolded through occupation and resistance, where women often played roles as dangerous as those of armed soldiers. Nancy Wake moved through Nazi-occupied territory, organizing sabotage operations and coordinating with Allied forces, her work blurring the line between civilian and combatant. Similarly, Noor Inayat Khan operated as a wireless operator in France, maintaining fragile communication networks under constant threat of capture and execution. But these incredible feats are sometimes forgotten or pushed to the margins of niche history, or even simply relegated by the fact that many historians have been far more obsessed with one thing.
Talking about prostitution is more fun than talking about dead people. The other thing is that you actually hear more about prostitution in military records than you hear in ordinary early modern records. So prostitutes are they're a problem for administrators and officers. Particularly, they're seen as a problem because people fight over them, so they're not great for morale. And then other people say, well, they are good for morale because these guys need a release. So there's a sort of a debate about them, which means that they make it into the records more than they would otherwise do. There's certainly a concern about venereal disease.
Yeah.
And venereal disease very often is blamed on women anyway in the early modern period, and prostitutes in an army camp are particularly vulnerable to being the ones who get punished for having a venereal disease, even though, well, it goes both ways, but not for officers in early modern armies. So there's some quite dramatic accounts of the punishment of prostitutes who were deemed to be spreading diseases to the troops. So, and then in the 19th century, as the attacks on camp followers and baggage trains accelerate, it becomes in the interests of reformers to paint all camp followers as prostitutes. So that's, just one of the things that kind of happens in any situation like this, where you're trying to kick out women. You tar them all with the epithet of prostitute, or being a prostitute.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of an old story. But I think one interesting thing about prostitution, not necessarily in army camps, but in army camps and any place where armies are, which very often is just in towns, not in special camps. I think one of the interesting things that happens in a lot of garrison towns, particularly, or port towns, is that you have a real increase in sex for money, but also other kinds of activities that women usually do start being exchanged for money. So nursing, lodging, cooking for people, sex, making clothes. So it means that these services grow up in these communities, which you can still see today. In towns where there's a lot of, large complements of militaries. These services for cash that in a normal economy would be free, because women do a lot of this kind of work for free in families. But in garrison towns, these get to be commodified. So it has this really pretty interesting effect on some of these sort of well-known garrison or port towns: Le Havre, London, Amsterdam,
Right.
Stockholm, Madrid, where you have lots and lots of militaries coming through. It really kind of changes the whole kind of fabric of what wage work is, and one assumes also the fabric of relations between men and women, since all of these services that had previously been a lot of the time done for free, not always, but a lot of the time done for free, suddenly start being something you do for cash. And prostitution is just kind of a symbol of that, even though there's lots of things that women are selling for cash other than sex.
Whether part of the baggage train, the service industry, or on the battlefield, women have been there, but their participation in European armies was rarely straightforward or officially sanctioned, yet it was consistently present. From the baggage train to the front lines and everywhere in between, women entered the sphere of war through moments where necessity, ideology, or personal resolve overrode convention. Their stories do not form a simple narrative. Instead, they showed what societies claimed women could do and what, in the extremity of war, they actually did. And that should never be forgotten or eroded. Thank you for joining me today, and a special thanks to Margaret Hunt. Hostile History was written by me, David Boris, and is part of the Canyon Entertainment umbrella. You can find Hostile History on Facebook by following Hostile History. You can find us on Instagram by following Canyon Entertainment. Hostile History was produced by Curious Cast, podcasts for curious minds. Our senior producer is Dila Velasquez. Our audio producer and sound designer is Rob Johnston. Our executive producer is Chris Dunner-Duncombe, the director of podcasting and streaming for Curious Cast. Can't wait for you to join us next time. And until then, keep your powder dry.
Cozy season is ahead, and you'll be spending way more time inside. Is your home ready? Don't worry. With Wayfair, you can upgrade your space without breaking the bank. Score up to 70% off during their Labor Day clearance on furniture, area rugs, mattresses, and more. Plus, surprise flash deals you can't miss. Whether it's one room or the whole house, Wayfair has pieces for every style and budget.
Shop Wayfair's Labor Day clearance now through September 7th at wayfair.com.
Wayfair, every style, every home.